Welcome to How It Works with Holger. Here's hopefully another very useful case for you that you can apply to all your future Delphi projects. I at least have seen it with quite a few customers that they did not know how to allow dates to be empty in their Delphi applications. Obviously, when you look at databases, it's easy. You have a field definition, your field is of type date, and then you can say, hey, allow null as a value. And the null value by definition means there is no value assigned to the field. Easy. However, as soon as you read this kind of record into Delphi, what are you going to do with your null values? What I see quite often is that people use Boolean values in addition to the field that they have. They say, hey, is this field empty? Yes or no? And then they write their code accordingly. If the field is empty, then they proceed in a different direction as if the field has a value. However, that doesn't help us for the user interface. In a nutshell, I will talk about what's a nullable. Before we look at the example, I have to confess that Delphi, even in the year 2022, still does not have any representation for nullable values or null values in the language. And that might seem like a big problem, but it really isn't, because there's great guys in the community that build these things for us. And you can use nullable values even with dates. And that's what we're going to look at today. So here we see a date on the form inside of a date time picker. I only set the date time picker to represent the date. In addition to the date, I also have a checkbox which I can check. And let's look at the behavior of this form so we get a feel for it. So unless I click finished, I'm unable to select the date. So if I click finished, it switches and I can select a different date. I can say what is the date, and I get the date that I selected. So if I click finished again, so there is no date, and I say what is the date, project not finished, I said like project not finished or no finished date selected, that is the reply. And of course you might say, well, you're just checking the checkbox, and if the checkbox is not checked, you say, well, there is no date checked. Yes, that's one possible solution. However, I want the value that I have, the date value, to represent that it doesn't have a value. And that is tricky in Delphi, because by default, if we go to the representation of a date value in Delphi, we know that tDate, if we look it up, is a tDate time, and tDate time, if we look that up right here, is nothing but a double. And a double value does not is not a pointer, so it can't be nil, which is also sometimes used as a representation for no value. You can't assign nil to a double. So the solution I see quite often is that developers design one certain time or date as the neutral null value and check for that. So if it's that value, because it's unlikely that this date is going to be selected anyway, that's my null value. So you read in the code, there is a constant, this is the null value, and people compare it to this. If it's this value, okay, the date is null. However, that gives you additional programming when you then write it back to the database, because in the database you want it to be null again. So there's always additional logic required. It is much, much easier to use nullable. So you say, I want a nullable of type tDate. And where does this null come from? Well, in Delphi, we have quite a few options. I here selected the Spring network, Spring for Delphi, but there's also commercial solutions from TMS in the Biz core library. They have a nullable value, which is also used for Aurelius, for Xdata. So in Aurelius and Xdata, you have nullable values because, think about it, Aurelius is an object relational mapper, so that needs to be able to map null values to your classes and objects. So because of that, they also have a nullable implementation. There's also the Jose frameworks from Paolo Rossi that have a nullable value, for example. So there's quite a few options for you. I selected Spring because Spring is very, very easy to install, and it is available for a large amount of different Delphi versions. So you don't need the newest Delphi version. I'm not saying that that is the case for the other solutions, but Spring really is great because it's also easy to install. Stefan Glinke is the author of Spring 4D, and you can simply, if you're not into Git, the versioning system that he uses on Bitbucket, you can simply go to downloads and download the latest version from the download repository. And then if you extracted the source code to a directory, I called this Spring 4D, Stefan supplies you with a build tool. So you simply double click here and it automatically installs everything into all the IDEs that are installed on your system. In this case, I only have Delphi 11, and it even allows you to use the different compilers, meaning Windows 32, 64, macOS, macOS ARM, Linux, and iOS, and if I had it installed, even Android, I'm quite certain. So the installation is automatic, and if you've run this, you're able to simply use Spring. And inside of Spring, you find the definition, if you look for it, of the type nullable, right here in the region for nullable types. And nullable is internally, as you can see here, a record or a generic record, and that's how we use it. So if we want to give our users the ability to specify no value for a date, we simply specify nullable tdate. And what that does, let me go into the source code to show you or to play around with this a little bit. Just some point, let's say I have a date, L date, and that is of type nullable, T date. I then can say L date equals, for example, now. So that assigns now to my date. So now L date would have a value. And L date also offers helper methods where you can say, here you can say get value or default, and you can specify the default date that you would like. Or here you can say toString, toVariant, and the most important one of them all, you have value where you can access the tdate value, and has value where you can ask, does the date have a value or is it null? Because Delphi, the Delphi language has gotten better and better, you no longer need the value property, because formally I wouldn't need to write LDate value is now. However, with recent language improvements, I simply can write LDate equals now, and the compiler does everything for us. Asking if LDate has a value, I simply write if LDate has a value, and I get a Boolean value in return, true or false. And if I want to assign null, I simply say LDate equals nil, which normally would not work. If another date here, if I have it as tdate, I'm not able to say another date equals null. That won't work, because a pointer can't be assigned to a tdate. However, I can assign nil to LDate because LDate is of nullable tdate. So let's put it all together. In order to use it with a VCL control, of course, you can't assign a nullable date to a VCL control because the VCL itself does not have support for this nullable. There is other user interface controls from third-party providers that have like this checkbox implemented inside of the date picker. So you can say allow selection of null, and then this little checkbox appears. And if you click the checkbox, the user interface becomes available, basically mimicking what I implemented here. So as soon as we click on finished, I want to enable this. So I implemented a property, which is called isFinished. And then the state, finished or not finished, determines if the finished date control, which is called DTFinished, is enabled or not. And if I read the finished date, right here, finished date, which is a nullable, I then, in the getter, and this is where the magic lies, I, by default, say there is no value assigned. So I say result is null. Remember, I return a nullable tDate. And if is finished, which goes back to the control on the form, if it is checked, then the user indicated that the date that is selected is indeed the finished date. I say result is dt finished date. So in this case, I either return nil, which means I have null, no value, or I return the date in case there actually is a date. And putting it all together, when I click the button here, instead I call show date, and instead of just checking the checkbox, I'll literally go to finish date, and I say if finish date has a value, then show that value, otherwise show the message project not finished. So I indeed use the date, the nullable date, and not just the ability of the user interface to determine if the finished date has been selected or not. So at this point, if you have this nullable tDate, you have a data type that you can use with no value. It sounds strange, with no value, or you have a variable that either has no value or it has a value. And that is something that you are used to from database programming. In this way, you also have it inside of your Delphi source code, which is a great benefit to have. Of course, this is not only true for dates or date times. You can also use it with integers, doubles, or your own types. You can define your own types as nullable, and there is a value assigned or not. The great thing is that nullable is a record. So as you see right here, there is no additional memory management involved to create the nullable or free the nullable. That is all handled by the compiler. So we're already at the end of how it works with Holger. Hopefully this was an interesting use case for you. If it was, give us a thumbs up. And as always, if you have suggestions, email me at holger@flixengineering.com with your suggestions for future episodes.